December 8, 1941. The humid jungles of the Philippines sweltered beneath a blazing sun. A column of Japanese infantry pushed forward, their bayonets gleaming, their breath steady with discipline, their ration bags tight at their sides. They marched with the confidence of conquerors. On the other side of the ridge, American troops scattered, underprepared, retreating, huddled around their campfires. The Japanese had been taught to think of the enemy as soft, spoiled, dependent on luxuries. American soldiers, they were told, could not survive without coffee, candy, or canned goods. To the proud veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army, hardened by years of training, this was a source of laughter. They sneered at the strange tins of meat found in abandoned supply dumps, laughed at the colorful wrappers of chocolate bars left behind in trenches, and mocked the very idea of a soldier needing candy to fight. Children's food, some whispered. Weakness, others said. But as the days dragged on, and the jungle began to swallow men whole, a strange transformation began to unfold. The jungle was merciless. Leeches clung to skin. Malaria spread like wildfire. Rice balls wrapped in paper, the standard ration of the imperial soldier, spoiled quickly in the damp heat. Dried fish grew rancid. The simple soy-based pickles that had been staples of their diet were soon gone, replaced by hunger. At first, the Japanese laughed even harder at the sight of greasy tins of Spam. What soldier, they asked, would willingly eat pork squeezed into a gelatinous brick, drowned in salt? What kind of warrior needed Hershey's chocolate to summon courage? They shook their heads and carried on. Yet when hunger gnawed at their bellies, when the body's strength began to wither, the laughter died. By the second week of fighting around Bataan, patrols of Japanese soldiers were raiding American camps, not for rifles, not for maps, not for boots, but for rations. The same tins that had been mocked as a symbol of weakness now became trophies, prizes more precious than captured ammunition. A single bar of chocolate, once sneered at as childish, could fuel a man for an entire march through the jungle. A can of Spam fried over a small fire was enough to make starving men weep with gratitude. They ate, and they did not laugh anymore. Some wrote home, astonished at the taste. Others hoarded what little they found, trading Spam for cigarettes, chocolate for favors. The food they had ridiculed became the food they craved. The clash of cultures was more than military. It was culinary, visceral, elemental. The Japanese military machine had been built on sacrifice and austerity. A soldier was expected to endure, to eat little, to fight hungry if needed. Rice and pickles were not just food, they were symbols of discipline. To require anything more was seen as weakness. The Americans, by contrast, marched with tins and boxes, with candy and gum, with powdered coffee and cigarettes tucked neatly inside small khaki-colored packets known as Rations. To the Japanese, these were luxuries. To the Americans, they were lifelines. And in the brutal cauldron of the Pacific, lifelines often meant survival. Imagine the scene. April 1942, a Japanese patrol sweeping through a captured U.S. position on the slopes of Mount Samat. Rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the shadows. They pause when one soldier opens a green box left behind in the dirt. Inside, biscuits, a bar of chocolate, a packet of powdered lemonade and a tin of Spam. Laughter erupts. The Americans eat like kings, one man says. They pass the items around, mocking, until one soldier takes a cautious bite of chocolate. Sweetness floods his mouth, rich, unfamiliar. Another tastes Spam, its salty fat melting on his tongue, unlike anything he had ever eaten before. Silence replaces laughter. Eyes widen. Soon the men are eating with their hands, tearing open every packet they can find. Hunger overwhelming discipline. The irony was bitter, and yet undeniable. What they once called weakness now gave them strength. This was not just about food. It was about perception, about the collision between two worlds of war-making. The Japanese believed in spirit, the willpower of men, the hunger to endure. The Americans believed in supply, the science of feeding millions, the power of factories thousands of miles away. It was a contest, not just of rifles and tanks, but of lunchboxes and ration tins. And on the battlefields of the Pacific, it became clear, spirit could inspire, but without food, without energy, without calories, spirit could starve. The laughter at Spam and chocolate did not last long. Reports filtered back through the ranks of the Imperial Army. American rations, though strange, were astonishingly effective. Soldiers fought longer, marched further, recovered quicker. They were sustained not by will alone, but by sugar, salt, protein and fat packed neatly into durable tins and bars. The Japanese began to scavenge them relentlessly, and in secret, many admitted admiration. Spam became a rare prize, something to trade, something to hide in packs for desperate nights. Chocolate became more than a luxury. It was fuel, quick energy in the chaos of battle. What had begun as ridicule turned into envy, and then into a quiet craving. Across the Pacific, this story repeated itself. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops, cut off from their supply lines, fought for weeks on little more than rice and coconuts. American Marines, meanwhile, unwrapped chocolate bars between firefights, chewed gum as they dug foxholes, fried Spam in helmets turned into makeshift pans. Captured Japanese diaries told the same tale: admiration, disbelief and hunger. Some wrote of Spam as if it were a delicacy, a forbidden luxury from another world. Others spoke of chocolate as a miraculous medicine, lifting morale in the darkest moments. The ridicule of American rations had transformed into a haunting desire. War is not fought only with bullets. It is fought with calories, with logistics, with the science of keeping men alive under impossible conditions. The Japanese soldiers laughed at Spam and chocolate, but hunger silenced their laughter. The American soldier, though mocked as soft, carried in his pack the quiet power of an industrial empire. Factories in Chicago, assembly lines in Detroit, dairy farms in Wisconsin, all condensed into tins and wrappers that fit in a single pouch. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And in the unforgiving jungles and islands of the Pacific, that difference meant everything. The opening chapters of the Pacific War revealed a hidden truth, one that Japanese officers would only grudgingly admit, and one that American GIs would come to rely on. The laughter of the early days gave way to silence, then to craving, then to an unspoken respect. A soldier's spirit could march him forward, but it was Spam and chocolate that kept him standing. Summer of 1942. The Pacific was a vast burning chessboard. The Japanese Empire, intoxicated by victory, had swept from Pearl Harbor to Singapore, from the Philippines to the jungles of New Guinea. Everywhere their banners rose. Their soldiers marched light, carrying rifles, bayonets and small cloth ration bags filled with rice, dried fish, and pickled vegetables. To them, endurance was not just necessity, it was virtue. A soldier who could fight hungry, who could starve and still advance, was proof of Japan's moral superiority. Across the ocean, the United States was scrambling, stunned by losses but awakening to the demands of total war. While Japanese doctrine glorified spirit, the Americans turned to science, industry, and logistics. In that clash of philosophy lay the seeds of an unexpected battlefield advantage, the simple contents of a soldier's pack. The doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army was shaped by decades of culture and hardship. Rice had been their staple for centuries. Soldiers were trained to survive on as little as 800 grams per day, barely enough to sustain a man in combat. Discipline was survival. Hunger was proof of loyalty. Officers preached that an imperial soldier could march on an empty stomach where an American would collapse. This doctrine came from experience in China, where Japanese troops often lived off the land, seizing rice and livestock from villages as they advanced. They assumed the same method would work in the Pacific, across the jungles and islands of a new war. But here, the land was not generous. Coconut groves could not feed armies. The jungle gave little but disease. Malaria, dysentery and dengue consumed more men than bullets. The philosophy of endurance began to fray. The Americans, by contrast, built their war machine on the principle that a well-fed soldier fights better, marches longer, and suffers less. It was not a matter of luxury, but of efficiency. When America entered the war, its military leadership faced a daunting question: how to feed millions of men scattered across continents and oceans. The answer came in the form of standardized rations. From the M-unit cans of World War I, the Quartermaster Corps evolved a system of carefully engineered meals. By 1942, the K ration and C ration became symbols of American ingenuity. Each packet contained calories calculated for combat, blending proteins, fats, sugars, and caffeine. A soldier could find chocolate next to powdered lemonade, Spam next to biscuits. It was not fine dining, it was survival science, wrapped in khaki-colored boxes. The cultural contrast was stark. Japanese propaganda mocked American soldiers as dependent on canned meat and sweets. They portrayed them as weak, unable to endure hardship. Soldiers in training camps were told to laugh at the strange foods they would find on the battlefield. To the Japanese way of thinking, discipline was measured in hunger endured, not calories consumed. Yet in practice, the Japanese logistical system was brittle. Convoys were vulnerable to submarines. Long supply lines stretched thin across vast waters. As campaigns dragged on, Japanese troops often went without their precious rice. Starvation became a weapon used against them, eroding morale and physical strength. Meanwhile, American soldiers, though far from home, rarely fought without rations in their packs. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and New York churned out millions of cans and bars, loading ships that crossed the Pacific in endless convoys. The machine of American industry ensured that even in foxholes on Guadalcanal or ridges in New Guinea, soldiers could eat. By mid-1942, this difference began to show. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched repeated night assaults, charging with bravery and ferocity. But by day, their bodies withered. Many fought on half rations, their rice infested with insects, their pickled vegetables long gone. American Marines, though battered and exhausted, opened their tins of Spam and unwrapped chocolate bars between battles. They drank powdered coffee in foxholes, chewed gum to calm nerves, smoked cigarettes included in every pack. The calories they consumed gave them strength to keep digging, keep fighting, keep surviving. Japanese survivors later admitted that hunger was their fiercest enemy. Their officers preached spirit, but spirit could not fill an empty stomach. Historical records capture this irony with chilling clarity. Reports from captured Japanese diaries speak of envy and astonishment. Soldiers wrote of tasting Spam for the first time, of marveling at the sweetness of chocolate, of hoarding captured rations like treasure. These were men who had once laughed at American food, now admitting that their own supplies could not compare. Hunger forced them to see the truth. The enemy's strength was not softness but abundance. The broader context of the war made this more than a culinary curiosity. It was a strategic fault line. The Japanese war machine was designed for short campaigns, swift victories, and exploitation of conquered lands. It was never built to sustain years of fighting across thousands of miles. America, by contrast, mobilized its entire industrial base to supply not just weapons but meals. Spam and chocolate became tools of empire, just as vital as tanks and planes. The laughter of the Japanese soldiers masked a deeper truth. Their system could not match the relentless tide of American production. What they called weakness was in fact one of the strongest weapons the United States possessed. This mismatch grew more pronounced as the war dragged on. In the Philippines, Japanese troops often went days without rice. In Burma, men collapsed from malnutrition. On isolated islands cut off by American naval blockades, thousands starved to death. The American GI, meanwhile, grumbled about the monotony of Spam, cursed the taste of powdered eggs, mocked the toughness of C-ration biscuits. But he ate. He stayed alive. And when the fighting resumed, he had strength to fight again. That was the silent advantage, hidden in plain sight, packed into every tin and wrapper. As the world watched the Pacific War unfold, the image of the laughing Japanese soldier mocked the American ration. Yet history turned the laughter into irony. The same Spam and chocolate that were ridiculed became lifelines for those who captured them. The battlefield revealed what propaganda could not conceal in modern war. Survival is not about what you can endure without but what you can sustain with. Spirit inspires men to march. Food keeps them marching. And in the jungles, on the beaches, in the foxholes of the Pacific, it was Spam and chocolate that tipped the scales. The stage was set. The Japanese would continue to laugh, but their rations would wither. The Americans would continue to eat, even if with complaints. And in that contrast, a new chapter of the war's outcome was being written, not in grand strategy meetings or tank battles, but in the humble, greasy tins and sweet wrappers of soldiers' rations. January 1943. The Pacific War had settled into a grinding stalemate of attrition. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops, gaunt, disease-ridden and half-starved, emerged from the jungle, night after night, charging American lines with the ferocity of men driven more by desperation than nourishment. Their rice supplies had long since dwindled, their pickled vegetables rotted, their dried fish consumed weeks before. Many carried nothing in their ration bags but hope and a handful of moldy rice grains. Yet across the battlefield, American Marines huddled in muddy foxholes, unwrapping waxed paper packets with practiced ease. A bar of Hershey's chocolate slipped into a soldier's hand like a lifeline. A tin of Spam opened with a dull clink, hissed with the release of salt and fat. The contrast was stark, one army struggling to keep men alive on failing logistics, the other quietly sustained by an industrial miracle hidden inside brown boxes. The advantage was not accidental. In 1941, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had studied the failures of World War I rations, stale hardtack, spoiled canned meats, and low morale, and resolved not to repeat them. They turned to scientists, nutritionists, and industrial titans. Anshel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, designed what became the K-ration, a compact high-calorie meal designed for paratroopers and infantry in the field. Each box contained a calculated blend of protein, fat, and sugar, enough to fuel a soldier through combat. Spam, produced by Hormel Foods, became the ubiquitous canned meat, packed with sodium to endure the tropics. Hershey's produced chocolate bars, not just as treats, but as deliberate morale boosters, dense with calories. Even chewing gum was included, serving the dual purpose of calming nerves and keeping soldiers' mouths moist in sweltering heat. This was not luxury, it was weaponized nutrition. The Japanese, by contrast, clung to tradition. The gohan, or rice ball, remained the staple. Soldiers carried them wrapped in paper or cloth, supplemented by dried fish or tsukemono pickles. It was a diet forged in centuries of austerity, meant to symbolize discipline. But in the Pacific, this tradition became vulnerability. Rice spoiled in the humidity. Insects infested storage sacks. Supply convoys were sunk by American submarines, leaving isolated garrisons to wither. Japanese doctrine emphasized foraging from local lands, but tropical jungles offered little sustenance, and the populations of conquered islands often suffered starvation themselves. The hidden advantage of the American soldier lay not only in firepower but in the calories of Spam and the sugar of chocolate. Every bite represented a factory back home, a rail line humming, a ship delivering supplies across the Pacific. It was the silent machinery of war. German observers, allied with Japan, noted the difference with astonishment. Reports from German officers in North Africa, and later in Europe, remarked on the sheer abundance of American rations. They noted how every GI seemed to have sweets, gum and cigarettes, while their own soldiers endured shortages. For the Japanese, the shock was greater. At first they mocked American rations as indulgence, laughing at the absurdity of soldiers needing candy to march. But captured diaries reveal the shift. One soldier wrote, "The American chocolates, sweet like nothing I have known, they give strength to continue." Another scribbled about Spam, marveling at its taste and longevity. Strange meat, salty, but it fills the stomach. What began as ridicule, transformed into grudging admiration, and finally into craving. The laughter that once echoed through training camps was replaced by silence in the jungle, as starving men scavenged discarded tins and wrappers. The impact rippled beyond the battlefield. Japanese morale eroded with hunger, while American morale was reinforced by small comforts. The presence of chocolate and Spam reminded the GI of home, of family, of a world beyond mud and fire. A Hershey bar in a foxhole was more than sugar. It was a symbol of connection. Spam, fried in a helmet with a pinch of stolen salt, became a ritual of survival, a taste of normalcy. For the Japanese soldier, eating American rations in secret carried a strange irony, a quiet acknowledgement that the enemy's strength lay not just in tanks and planes but in the unseen empire of supply. This hidden advantage was invisible to maps and strategy tables, yet it shaped the outcome of campaigns. At the heart of this transformation lay the simple truth. War is a contest of endurance. Spirit can inspire charges into machine gun fire, but without fuel, bodies collapse. The American advantage in rations was invisible to those who measured war in numbers of divisions or tons of bombs. But on the ground, where men's stomachs growled louder than their rifles, the difference was undeniable. An American soldier sustained by Spam and chocolate fought with strength day after day. A Japanese soldier, weakened by hunger, fought with courage but diminishing energy. The battlefield revealed which philosophy could truly endure. The irony deepened as the war dragged on. In occupied territories, Japanese civilians and soldiers alike began to seek out Spam and chocolate, commodities brought by the enemy. On Guam, on Saipan, in the Philippines, these once mocked foods became symbols of survival. Even after the war, Spam and Hershey's chocolate lingered in Asia, woven into diets and memories, a legacy of wartime hunger. The laughter of 1941 had long since died. What replaced it was a craving that transcended the battlefield, a reminder that power in war is measured not only in steel and fire, but in the simple act of feeding men. By the end of 1943, the hidden advantage was no longer hidden. American officers knew their men fought better because they were fed. Japanese officers knew their men faltered because they were starving. Yet pride and doctrine prevented change. The Imperial Army clung to its traditions, even as they buried soldiers weakened not by bullets but by hunger. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their ration system, shipping millions more tins and bars across the Pacific. Spam and chocolate had become as much weapons of war as rifles and artillery, carried into every battle, sustaining an army that would not stop until the war was won. September 1944. The skies over France burned with the roar of engines. Allied columns pushed eastward, armored steel crawling across the countryside, infantry marching behind them. In one small French village, German soldiers searched the wreckage of an abandoned American convoy. Rifles ready, boots crunching over rubble, they stumbled across something odd, boxes of green wax-sealed parcels. They tore them open. Inside lay biscuits, coffee powder, chewing gum, chocolate, and the ubiquitous tin of Spam. At first, laughter erupted. "This is what the Americans fight on," one German corporal sneered. "Candy and pig fat." The men passed the tins around, mocking. Yet hunger silenced the mockery. Within minutes, the same soldiers were eating ravenously, chocolate melting on their tongues, Spam sizzling over a makeshift fire. They ate, and their laughter faded into quiet awe. Even the mighty Wehrmacht, with all its discipline and efficiency, was unprepared for the industrial miracle that poured across the Atlantic in the form of American rations. The technical edge was astonishing when examined in detail. The American K ration, designed by Dr. Anshel Keys, weighed just over 28 ounces and delivered nearly 3,000 calories per day. Each box contained 3 meals, breakfast, dinner and supper, packaged with scientific precision. Breakfast offered canned meat, biscuits, a cereal bar, coffee and chewing gum. Dinner carried cheese or Spam, crackers, lemonade powder, and a chocolate bar. Supper included more meat or cheese, hard biscuits, candy and cigarettes. Nothing was random. Every item was calculated to deliver energy, electrolytes and morale. The Hershey's chocolate bar alone packed nearly 600 calories, engineered to withstand heat without melting. A marvel of food science disguised as candy. Spam was the centerpiece. First produced in 1937 by Hormel Foods, it became an unlikely icon of the war. Made from pork shoulder and ham, ground and canned with salt and preservatives, Spam was compact, durable, and nearly indestructible. Its shelf life stretched for years, surviving humidity, salt water, and tropical heat. A single can contained 1,000 calories of fat and protein-dense fuel for combat. By 1945, over 150 million pounds of Spam had been shipped overseas, stacked in pyramids aboard Liberty ships, unloaded onto beaches from Normandy to Okinawa. Soldiers loved it, hated it, mocked it, but ate it every day. It became the culinary soundtrack of the war. The technical brilliance extended to chocolate. The Hershey Corporation, under government contract, developed the D-Ration bar in 1937. Compact and heat-resistant, it contained cocoa, sugar, skim milk powder, oat flour, and vitamin fortifications. Soldiers called it Hitler's secret weapon because it was so hard to chew. Yet it served its purpose, delivering energy in moments of crisis. Later, Hershey introduced the tropical chocolate bar, engineered to withstand 120-degree heat in Pacific jungles without melting. By war's end, Hershey had produced over 3 billion bars for the US military. Chocolate was no longer a luxury. It was a weaponized morale booster. Japanese rations, by comparison, appeared primitive. The standard issue was a simple cotton bag containing rice, dried fish, miso paste, and pickled vegetables. Calories ranged from 1,600 to 2,000 per day, barely enough for men in combat who burned twice that amount. There was little fat, little sugar, and no redundancy. Rice spoiled quickly in tropical humidity, insects infested supplies, and miso paste turned rancid. Soldiers often boiled grass, roots, or coconuts to supplement their meager meals. In New Guinea, entire regiments wasted away, their bodies skeletal, their spirits broken not by enemy fire, but by hunger. A Japanese officer once confessed, "Our soldiers fought with courage, but they died of starvation before they could die of bullets." The German system was stronger but still lacked the American scale. Wehrmacht rations often included rye bread, sausage, cheese, and ersatz coffee. Yet shortages plagued them as the war dragged on. By 1944, German troops fought on black bread mixed with sawdust, ersatz chocolate made from chicory and beets, and thin soups that filled the stomach but offered little fuel. The American soldier, meanwhile, lit a cigarette from his ration pack, washed down Spam with lemonade powder, and chewed gum while waiting for orders. The difference was not just technical, it was psychological. A soldier who ate felt connected to home, to abundance, to a machine that would not abandon him. A soldier who starved felt forgotten, expendable, already defeated. Production numbers tell the story more starkly than words. The United States produced 15 billion K rations and C rations between 1942 and 1945. Hershey's chocolate factories alone churned out 24 million bars every week. Hormel's Spam lines never stopped, producing 100 million cans per year. Detroit built tanks, but it also built canned meals. Chicago's factories produced biscuits by the millions. Logistics officers became as vital as generals, orchestrating convoys that carried not just bombs and bullets but food. German intelligence noted with alarm the sheer abundance of Allied rations. One report concluded, "The American soldier is never hungry. His supplies are limitless. Our soldiers envy him." On the battlefield, this technical edge translated into endurance. At Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, American paratroopers lived on Spam, biscuits, and chocolate bars dropped by air. At Iwo Jima, Marines fought for weeks on sea rations, their strength maintained by tins of meat and Hershey bars consumed between firefights. Japanese defenders, cut off from supplies, ate rats, roots, and even grass to stay alive. One American Marine remembered capturing a Japanese position and finding starving men chewing leaves. "They laughed at our food," he said, "but they would have killed for it." Factories and assembly lines thousands of miles away had become invisible weapons, their output sealed in tins and wrappers, carried in backpacks across continents. Spam and chocolate may have seemed trivial compared to rifles and tanks, but they represented the unseen tide of industrial war. Every can was a calorie advantage. Every bar was a morale victory. In the quiet mathematics of logistics, the Americans had already won before many battles began. The hidden advantage lay in the details: shelf life, caloric density, sugar content, protein balance, packaging durability. A Japanese rice ball spoiled in days. A Spam tin lasted years. A German ersatz bar melted in heat. A Hershey tropical bar survived the jungle. That was the science of survival, the arithmetic of victory, the hidden hand behind the battlefield. September 19, 1944. The rolling fields of Lorraine lay shrouded in early morning mist. German panthers crept forward through the haze, their turrets scanning, their crews weary but disciplined. Ahead of them, silence, then the sudden crack of American 76mm guns. Fire erupted, smoke swallowed the fields, and confusion spread like wildfire. At the Battle of Aracourt, the Americans fought not only with steel and speed, but with something far more mundane, far less visible: rations tucked into their packs. For as tanks clashed and artillery thundered, American soldiers, crouched in foxholes, unwrapped Hershey bars, tore into Spam, and drank powdered coffee. It was sustenance in chaos. And while German armor burned on the fields, their soldiers starved in the shadows, weakened by shortages, surviving on scraps. Aracourt was a battle of machines and men, but also of supply, of what each side carried in their packs when the firing stopped. This was not an isolated moment. Across Europe and the Pacific, American rations became silent allies in the bloodiest battles. At Monte Cassino in 1944, Allied soldiers climbed shattered slopes under artillery fire, living on tins of Spam and chocolate bars that sustained them through days of ruin. At Bastogne during the Siege of the Bulge, surrounded and freezing, paratroopers clung to their sea rations as lifelines. While artillery shells shook the earth, they ate in silence, meat hash in greasy tins, biscuits so hard they had to be broken with bayonets, and Hershey's chocolate that provided more than calories. It reminded them of home. German troops outside Bastogne, stretched thin and underfed, envied the abundance they glimpsed in captured ration packs. For them bread had become brittle, ersatz coffee bitter, chocolate replaced by chicory. Their discipline endured, but their stomachs betrayed them. In the Pacific, the contrast was even more brutal. On Guadalcanal, American Marines dug in under relentless assault. Each night, Japanese troops charged with screams of banzai. But as dawn came, those same troops staggered back, emaciated, weakened, starving. Cut off from supply, they boiled roots and chewed grass. American Marines, though exhausted, had Spam frying in helmets, crackers dipped into powdered soups, and chocolate bars passed along trenches. They cursed the monotony of their rations, but they ate. They endured. On Iwo Jima, as the volcanic island erupted with fire and blood, Marines lived on chocolate and canned meat between assaults on pillboxes. For Japanese defenders, there was no such supply. Many died with empty stomachs, their final days haunted by hunger more than fear of bullets. Numbers painted the picture in stark relief. At Aracourt, American armored divisions lost 25 tanks, but the Germans lost over 80. At Bastogne, 101st Airborne held for weeks, supplied in part by ration drops, while German soldiers outside struggled to keep their men fed. On Guadalcanal, by January 1943, Japanese casualties reached nearly 25,000, yet more than half were due not to combat, but to starvation and disease. American casualties were horrific, but far fewer fell to hunger. The invisible hand of rations tilted the scales. Spam and chocolate, mocked as symbols of softness, became weapons that hardened men against despair. Captured reports from German units revealed their astonishment. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "The Americans have more food than they can eat. Their soldiers throw away tins of meat we would fight for." Japanese diaries echoed this sentiment with greater desperation. A corporal in New Guinea scribbled, "The enemy eats chocolate even in battle. We eat grass." For armies trained to laugh at indulgence, reality turned ridicule into envy, and envy into bitter craving. In foxholes and bunkers, starving men whispered about Spam as though it were treasure, as though the greasy, salty block of pork held the key to survival. The irony deepened when American troops shared their rations. Prisoners of war, broken and skeletal, often received Spam and chocolate from their captors. Some cried as they ate. For them, the taste was unforgettable. Spam was not just meat, it was a miracle in a can. Chocolate was not just candy, it was salvation in sweetness. These encounters, repeated across battlefields and prison camps, showed how rations became more than logistics. They became symbols of abundance versus scarcity, of survival versus starvation, of an industrial empire feeding its sons while others left theirs to hunger. Every battle example reinforced the same truth. At Normandy, GIs stormed ashore with K-rations in waterproof bags, eating chocolate between firefights on the beach. At Peleliu, Marines endured weeks of hell, clinging to Spam and cigarettes when the heat and blood threatened to break them. At Okinawa, as kamikazes struck and shells rained down, American soldiers still unwrapped Hershey bars to steady their nerves before advancing again. The Japanese defenders, reduced to desperate measures, fought bravely but hollowed by starvation. The battlefield itself testified, victory belonged not only to courage, but to calories. And yet, the irony never faded. Soldiers cursed their rations, joked about spam, mocked the toughness of biscuits, and groaned at the monotony of chocolate bars. They traded them, tossed them, complained endlessly, but they lived. Their enemies, who once laughed at such food, starved and craved the very tins they had ridiculed. The laughter that began in 1941 had died long before 1945. What remained was a hard lesson, written in hunger and blood. An army marches not just on spirit, but on food. And at Aracourt, Bastogne, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and beyond, spam and chocolate proved to be weapons as decisive as any rifle or tank. The war was not won by battles alone, but by what those battles did to the minds of men. The hidden advantage of American rations struck at the core of morale, gnawing away at Japanese confidence and deepening the chasm between propaganda and reality. For years, imperial doctrine had preached that the Japanese soldier was invincible, sustained by spirit, able to march farther and fight harder with less. In training camps, recruits were told that Americans were weak, dependent on luxuries, unable to endure hardship. Spam and chocolate were ridiculed as proof of decadence. Yet in the jungles of New Guinea, on the ridges of the Philippines, and in the tunnels of Iwo Jima, hunger spoke louder than ideology. The laughter faded. The truth was undeniable. American rations kept men alive. Japanese rations let men waste away. And no sermon of spirit could overcome the agony of an empty stomach. Psychologically, the disparity was crushing. American soldiers, though they cursed the monotony of spam, or the chalky bite of the D-ration bar, knew that food would come. Supply lines stretched across oceans, but convoys kept arriving. They could depend on calories, cigarettes and candy to carry them through the darkest days. Even in Bastogne, when surrounded and freezing, the knowledge that rations would be dropped from the sky kept hope alive. Every tin of meat and every bar of chocolate was more than sustenance. It was proof that they were not forgotten. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, learned to expect hunger. He foraged desperately, ate insects and roots, gnawed on bark, and boiled weeds. Each day without rice was a silent admission that his empire could not sustain him. His commanders urged him to fight on spirit alone, but hunger stripped spirit bare. The contrast filtered into combat behavior. American units, well-fed and energized, could sustain prolonged offensives. They could dig deeper trenches, march longer distances, and endure night patrols with confidence. Japanese units, weakened by malnutrition, often launched reckless assaults. Banzai charges fueled more by desperation than by strategy. Starving soldiers rushed into gunfire not out of tactical calculation, but because hunger had broken them. Diaries captured this grim reality. No rice for 3 days. We charge tomorrow. Better to die in battle than starve in the jungle. What Japanese officers celebrated as courage was often the product of logistical collapse. Spirit was not enough. Calories were the currency of survival. The emotional toll cut even deeper. For American GIs, spam and chocolate carried the flavor of home. A Hershey bar tasted like childhood, like family, like safety. Spam fried in a helmet or eaten cold from a tin was mocked, but it filled bellies and reminded soldiers of abundance. Chewing gum calmed nerves before firefights, and coffee powder brewed in tin cups brought a moment of warmth in foxholes. These small comforts gave psychological armor against despair. For the Japanese soldier, food was a reminder of loss. Rice was sacred, the heart of his culture, but on the battlefield it came spoiled, meager, or not at all. Hunger became shame, a silent accusation that the empire had failed him. Spirit turned to bitterness as men realized their enemy, mocked as weak, was stronger because he could eat. Strategically, the impact was immense. American commanders could plan long campaigns knowing their men would remain nourished. Logistics officers became as vital as generals, ensuring that calories flowed as steadily as bullets. In the Pacific, jungle diseases ravaged both sides, but Americans resisted better, their diets fortified with protein, fat, and sugar. Japanese units, plagued by vitamin deficiencies and starvation, collapsed before they could achieve objectives. On Guadalcanal, thousands of Japanese died not from combat but from hunger and malaria, while Americans endured, however grudgingly, on spam and chocolate. In Europe, The Wehrmacht fought bravely but increasingly underfed, while the US Army fought with the strength of factories behind every ration. The psychological message was inescapable: America fed its soldiers like kings compared to their enemies. Abundance itself became a weapon. The enemy's perception was recorded in chilling testimonies. A German officer captured in Normandy confessed that his men envied the Americans' food more than their tanks. Japanese diaries told of cravings, of dreams haunted by chocolate and spam. One starving soldier wrote, "We laughed once at this food. Now it is all we wish for." Such admissions revealed the deeper truth. The Americans had not only outproduced their enemies in steel and oil, but in calories and comfort. The contrast became a psychological war in itself. Hunger ate at morale, and morale shaped battles as surely as bullets. The psychological ripple extended beyond soldiers. Civilians in occupied territories saw the abundance of American rations and compared it to their own deprivation. On liberated islands, spam and chocolate became symbols of hope, gifts passed out by GIs to children whose families had starved under Japanese occupation. For those civilians, these foods were not oddities, they were salvation. Japanese soldiers too, when captured, tasted spam and chocolate in prisoner-of-war camps. Many never forgot the shock, the sweetness, the salty richness that had once been mocked. It lingered in memory long after the war, a reminder that the empire which had promised victory through spirit had delivered only hunger. The impact was lasting. American soldiers came to associate spam and chocolate with survival, hardship, and victory. Japanese veterans remembered them as symbols of humiliation, of craving the enemy's food, while their own rice rotted in jungles. The psychological chasm defined the war as much as strategy and firepower. For one side, food was abundance and reassurance. For the other, it was scarcity and despair. And in modern war, despair is as deadly as any weapon. By 1945, the lesson was etched into the minds of every survivor. Spirit could inspire, but spirit could not replace food. The laughter of 1941 had become the bitterness of starvation by 1945. Spam and chocolate, once mocked, had reshaped morale, strategy, and even culture. The Japanese soldier who once sneered at American rations often ended the war dreaming of them, and for the American GI, these humble foods became memories carried home, reminders that victory was not only forged in blood and fire, but in the calories that kept men alive long enough to fight. August 1945. The war was ending, but its echoes carried into a world forever changed. Cities lay in ruins, empires collapsed, and millions of soldiers returned home with memories carved not only by bullets and bombs, but by the food that had sustained or failed. For the Japanese, defeat brought hunger on a national scale. Bombing campaigns had shattered supply chains. Rice, the sacred staple, was scarce. Civilians lined up for meager rations, many surviving on barley, millet, and sweet potatoes. Yet into this devastated landscape flowed something unexpected. American relief shipments, heavy with the very foods once mocked in wartime propaganda, spam, chocolate, powdered milk, and canned goods poured into ports and train stations, becoming lifelines for a starving nation. The irony was profound. The rations once ridiculed as symbols of weakness now filled empty stomachs, shaping post-war diets and leaving a permanent cultural mark. Spam became more than just food. It became a symbol of survival. In Japan, families fried it with rice, simmered it with noodles, or sliced it into soups. What had once been ridiculed as greasy pig fat in a can was now welcomed as protein in a land of scarcity. In Okinawa, devastated by battle, spam became a fixture of daily life, woven into dishes that endure to this day. Chocolate, too, carried a new meaning. American soldiers often handed out Hershey bars to Japanese children, acts of kindness in the ruins of war. For those children, the taste of sweetness was unforgettable, a bright memory against the backdrop of rubble and hunger. The foods once mocked as luxuries became cherished as salvation. The laughter of 1941 had turned into gratitude by 1945. The lesson was not lost on military thinkers. Allied commanders recognized that logistics, the ability to feed men reliably, abundantly, and scientifically, was as decisive as tanks or bombers. German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted at Nuremberg, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." His words meant to highlight radios and coordination, applied just as powerfully to food. America had mastered the art of sustaining armies across oceans, feeding millions in the field without collapse. The Japanese, clinging to tradition and spirit, had underestimated the power of calories. Their soldiers died bravely, but often they died hungry. In the cold mathematics of war, hunger is defeat. The Cold War carried this lesson forward. As the United States and Soviet Union vied for dominance, the science of rations evolved. The K-ration gave way to new meal combat, individual packs, refined for different climates and missions. Nutritional science advanced, with vitamins, freeze-drying and packaging innovations. Yet Spam and chocolate remained symbols of a truth discovered in the jungles of the Pacific and the fields of Europe, that food was as much a weapon as the rifle. During the Korean War, Spam once again filled the bellies of GIs and of civilians caught in the devastation. In Vietnam, Hershey bars and canned meats appeared in ration kits. Each generation of soldiers inherited the culinary legacy of World War II, tasting in every bite the logistical supremacy that America had forged. Beyond the battlefield, Spam and chocolate seeped into culture. In Japan, Spam found its place in Okinawan cuisine, in dishes like Spam musubi and champuru, fusions of American rations and local tradition. Across Asia and the Pacific, Spam became both symbol and staple, a reminder of war and a marker of resilience. Chocolate, once a novelty, became a symbol of kindness and abundance, carried in the memories of those who tasted it for the first time in ruined cities. The foods that once marked weakness became emblems of survival and adaptation. They transcended propaganda and humiliation, becoming part of daily life for millions long after the war. For veterans, the memory was more personal. American soldiers often joked about Spam fatigue, about eating it so often that they never wanted to see it again. Yet many admitted that it kept them alive when nothing else could. Chocolate bars, chewed in foxholes before dawn attacks, became symbols of nervous anticipation and fleeting comfort. For Japanese veterans, the memory was more complicated. Some recalled their first taste of Spam with disbelief, others with quiet shame, others still with gratitude. In memoirs and interviews, many admitted that hunger had broken them more than combat, and that American rations had left an indelible mark on their view of the war. The laughter of youth, mocking American luxuries, had given way to the bitter wisdom of experience. The legacy reached into modern warfare. In the Gulf War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, American troops carried rations designed with lessons from World War II. Calories first, morale second, portability always. Chocolate bars and processed meats remained staples, engineered with ever greater precision. The principle remained unchanged. A soldier fights best when he fights fed. The Japanese lesson that spirit alone cannot sustain armies was etched into doctrine worldwide. Modern militaries embraced logistics as the backbone of strategy, recognizing that food, fuel, and supply lines were the true lifeblood of campaigns. World War II had proven it with devastating clarity. And yet, the story of Spam and chocolate is more than military history. It is a human story of hunger and survival, of pride and irony, of laughter turned into craving. It is the story of men who mocked their enemies' food only to depend on it, of civilians who tasted sweetness in ruins, of nations that learned calories way more than slogans. In every tin of Spam, in every Hershey bar, there was a lesson written in salt and sugar, that war is not won by courage alone, but by endurance. And endurance comes not from spirit, but from sustenance. As the war closed, a new world emerged. Japan rebuilt, nourished in part by the foods of its former enemy. America learned that feeding armies was as vital as arming them. Veterans carried the memories home, some joking, some bitter, all remembering. Spam and chocolate, once weapons of mockery, had become weapons of victory. And in the final accounting of World War II, they stood as unlikely symbols of a universal truth, that in the machinery of modern war, connection outweighs firepower and calories defeat hunger as surely as bullets defeat flesh. The laughter had died in the jungles. What remained was silence, and the taste of Spam and chocolate on the tongues of those who had once mocked them.